So I want to talk now about these changes in King's rhetoric between what we saw in the letter and what we saw in Remaining Awake. Now, before I go on, I want to say I'm not trying to make huge divisions. There are certainly things that united King's rhetoric between those two. But some historians have argued that you can see changes both in King and in the larger civil rights movement, say changes between say 1965 and 1968. So, for instance, when I was in school, the civil rights movement I heard about really started in 1955 with a Montgomery bus boycott. And it pretty much ended in 1965 with the passage of major legislation, the Civil Rights Bill, and then the Voting Rights Act. We talked about that 10-year period, and it was the 10-year period where the civil rights movement was very focused on the South. It was a civil rights movement of the I Have a Dream speech. It was that massive change in how the law treated African Americans in the American South. Martin Luther King Jr., however, was killed in 1968, 3 years after the major pieces of legislation were passed. And to say, growing up, I didn't hear a lot about King in those years. He sort of did things in 1965, and he was killed in 1968, and not a lot in between. What some historians have argued is that King's rhetoric changed pretty significantly in those last 3 years and became a lot harder for people. King, when he died, was not a popular figure, really in any community. He was not terribly popular among white Americans. He wasn't terribly popular among black Americans. In 1967, I think it was the New York Times called him the angriest man in America, which isn't normally how we think about King. So what happened? Well, again, between 1955 and 1965, King's language seemed to assume this fit between American ideals, biblical justice, and the civil rights movement, that they were all basically about the same things. He acknowledged problems in the American past, but seemed to suggest that the essence of America was really on the side of the civil rights movement. Between 1965 and 1968, roughly, you could see changes in King's rhetoric, where he became more critical of the United States and more apt to suggest that there were things kind of inherent in the very essence of America that were not aligned with the civil rights movement. Why? Well, some historians have suggested a couple of things. One is that after 1965, the civil rights movement and King focused more of their attention on issues not just in the South, but in the North. So, for example, they go and they have a movement in Chicago aimed at housing issues. Now, again, this is a very different scenario in many ways from what had happened in the South. Housing issues in the North were not always de jure, that means by law. They didn't say that you had to live here or you had to live there. What happened was a little bit harder to tackle, which is that, say, real estate agents wouldn't show African Americans homes in white areas, or banks wouldn't lend to African Americans in white areas. Those are deep economic problems. They're in many ways harder to tackle. King and the civil rights movement, though, were very interested in tackling them. But one of the things that happened when they went to the North is that they found some people who they thought would be on their side. People like, I have here the Democratic mayor of Chicago, Mayor Daley, the head of the Democratic machine in Chicago, would be receptive because he had been supportive of the civil rights movement, basically speaking, when it was in the South. But King and his allies found that when it moved north and the civil rights movement talked more about larger economic problems and problems of power, not just in the South, but in the North, some white moderates and liberals in the North who had been okay with what they were doing in the South became a lot less interested in having those discussions. When people began to talk about desegregating schools in the North and working on housing problems in the North, there was a lot of pushback in places like Milwaukee and in Boston. People in the North weren't actually white people in the North weren't actually that excited about taking the civil rights movement, taking the complaints they had about segregated life in the South and moving them to the North. And some historians suggest that this really frustrated King. He was very disappointed in the response of the North. That was coupled with two other things. I forgot one of them there, so I'll just say it. One of them was the Black Power movement. This was a movement that is often associated with people like Malcolm X, that was more apt than, say, King to talk about violence, but even more than that, to talk about Black people needing to be economically and politically self-sufficient. This was the language of Malcolm X. A movement that was not as interested in working with white people in order to achieve ends, but really wanted to emphasize the ability of Black people to sustain themselves politically and economically. Now, there's a whole lot of spectrum in the Black Power movement and questions about tactics, but certainly King was pushed by people in the Black Power movement to think about whether or not sort of this vision of American ideals really had been ever the case, whether that was something that he could really draw upon given the way that America was. And finally, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War for King was incredibly discouraging for multiple reasons, but I'm going to emphasize two. One is King was a pacifist. Not all people involved in the civil rights movement were actual pacifists. Some of them thought that it was a good tactic to employ, but they weren't pacifists. King was really a pacifist. He believed that nonviolence was the way of God. So he had a problem with war as such. But also he saw the Vietnam War as taking away time and money that could have been given to issues related to civil rights and poverty. He had been a fan of President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society movement, which was sort of a second New Deal, a heavy investment by the government in all sorts of social programs. And he saw that money then being taken to Vietnam. He saw that a lot of the people fighting in Vietnam were poor, were minorities, because one of the ways to defer your time or get a number in the draft where you'd have less likelihood of going to war was to go to college. So men who went to college were less likely to be drafted in Vietnam. All of this made King incredibly frustrated. And together, these three things seemed to lead him to a greater critique of America and a real questioning of whether or not American ideals had ever been what they said. So, for example, this is actually kind of early one. This, I think, comes from 1964. King in a book called Why We Can't Wait. And listen to the language here. Our nation was born in genocide, when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shore, the scar of racial hatred had disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried, as a matter of national policy, to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today we are not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it. Our nation was born in genocide. It's a very striking language and sounds different than the I have a dream and this sort of sense that our national way of thinking about liberty and justice really support are the foundation of the American experiment and support civil rights. From his famous speech in which he came out opposed to the Vietnam War, he said, "We are convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for Black people, but instead affirm the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself unless the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear." In a way, we are agreeing with Langston Hughes, the Black Bard of Harlem, who had written earlier, "Oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." That poem from Hughes is worth pondering for a second, insofar as it seems to suggest that for someone like Hughes or someone like King, the idea here is that this America, again, that's about liberty and equality and justice, has never been true for us, and raises the question about whether it's ever really been true for anyone. It does, however, end on a hopeful note, which is that it will be, that it's not that it can never be that, it's that it needs to be made that. Still, this is a pretty striking indictment. So given all of that, and given where we started in 1955 with the death of Emmett Till, it's worth asking why the movement succeeded as much as it did. I think for looking back on it, we sort of say, well, of course it succeeded because it was in the right and this was a good thing and everyone agrees on it. But that was not clear in 1955. And certainly, again, African Americans had been working on civil rights for decades and hadn't necessarily gotten anywhere. And there were white people who had also been working on civil rights and hadn't necessarily made significant strides. So what made it succeed, and what made people willing to be part of it? Again, Emmett Till was killed in 1955 and his body was thrown into a river. It was not clear to people who were involved in this movement that they would get out of it alive, and certainly there were people who did die as part of the civil rights movement. So again, historian David Chappelle, not the comedian, the historian, has suggested a few things. He says, the civil rights movement succeeded for many reasons. This book isolates and magnifies one reason that has received insufficient attention. Black Southern activists got strength from old-time religion, and white supremacists failed at the same moment to muster the cultural strength that conservatives traditionally get from religion. Who succeeded in the great cultural battles over race and rights in the 1950s and 1960s? Those who could use religion to inspire solidarity and self-sacrificial devotion to their cause. Who did not have such religious power? Two groups. Those who failed, the segregationists, and those who succeeded only by attaching themselves to the religious protesters, the liberals. In other words, in his longer argument, what Chappelle argues is that for a lot of people who were involved in the civil rights movement, particularly the people you've never heard of or whose names we don't know, what spurred them on was not optimism. They weren't sort of optimistic about human nature. They didn't sort of think things just naturally get better, but a hope that they were on the side of God, that they were on the right side, and that they could trust in that even though there was all sorts of evidence that their movement would fail. That's also led historians to talk about this movement sometimes as a miracle. Again, I think sometimes people are sort of saying, well, the civil rights movement was great and anybody can do that and nonviolence works, and why doesn't just everybody do that all the time? And some historians have pointed out that it is miraculous that you had a group of people for so long willing to put themselves on the line in a nonviolent way, that isn't something you can just assume could happen or could happen again. So, in conclusion, what might we take from all this? Well, it raises questions about the American narrative. Who are we? The transition that we saw in King's language, I think, raises this question. For a lot of Americans, the story of America is a story of liberty and equality, not always perfectly implemented, but always what we're really about. This sort of sense that at the heart of America, there are these ideals. For others, there's a belief, probably increasingly, that really what's at the center of America is a story of race, a story of injustice, and that, as much as anything, is the story of America. I think you can see these two different ways of thinking about the United States playing out a lot of times in our political and cultural conversations. People who want to emphasize the ideals and say that there have been aberrations, but they're aberrations from the ideals. People who want to say that really at the heart is a commitment to something other than liberty and equality, something like racial division, class division, and those sorts of things. So I think it's a question worth asking. What is at the kind of the heart of America? Is it possible to say? Is it possible that both of these are part of our story and we have to think about them together? But it is a question that's I think this narrative raises. Um, More specifically with King, I think one of the things to notice is that King intentionally and knowingly broke his connection with power. We see this particularly in his willingness to protest the Vietnam War. King had a lot of access to political power. He could call up the White House and pretty much go over to tea. But when he came out against the Vietnam War, he lost his connection to somebody like Lyndon Baines Johnson. And King actually came out against the war when the war was still relatively popular, not necessarily in Berkeley, but the great majority of Americans, when King stood out against the war, still supported the war. So King made a very conscious decision to break his connection, his easy access to power. This raises questions, at least some theological questions for people who think in that way, about when you align and use power and when you break with it. When can you compromise? When can you work with those who have power? And when do you say, this is a line we cannot cross? In some ways, we talked about this very early in the semester with the Quakers. Where do you say, I simply am not willing to stand for this? And then what are the consequences you're willing to live with as a result? If you break your access to power, it's going to be harder to get what you want done. When is it okay to say, I'm willing to give up efficacy? I'm willing to give up effectiveness because I think this is the faithful or the right thing to do. That is a question that arises for people, not just with religious commitments, but any kind of commitment. And then the civil rights movement, I think, raises the question of the grounds of commitment. Again, going back to what Chappelle said, that for a lot of the people involved in the civil rights movement, what undergirded their actions was this sense that there was a God who was on their side, who would take care of them, even if that means they died. I think it's worth asking what kinds of grounds we have for our actions. It may not be the same grounds as the civil rights movement, but how do you keep yourself doing the right thing? Well, how do you know what the right thing is? And then how do you keep doing it even when you're not sure about the efficacy of what you're doing? How do you keep doing it when it doesn't seem like you'll succeed? How do you keep doing it at great cost? What underwrites that? What sustains it? How do you keep going? I think the civil rights movement is an episode that invites us to ask those questions about ourselves.